I'll call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Welcome our witnesses for our hearing on oversight of incentive auction implementation. So the subcommittee meets today to continue our oversight of the FCC's progress in implementing the incentive auction legislation that Congress passed last year. As you know, a successful broadcast incentive auction has the potential to bring significant revenue from the sale of spectrum to bear on our nation's broadband spectrum crunch, unleash innovation for consumers, create hundreds of thousands of jobs for Americans, provide funding to begin the process of building out a nationwide interoperable public safety broadband network, and make significant contributions to reducing the nation's deficit. But as with most things, the devil's in the details. We convened all 5 sitting FCC commissioners last December for a progress report on the implementation of the law. This was a first step in making sure that the Commission stays on track and acts within the confines of the law. In order to ensure that the FCC continues to follow the law, proper oversight is necessary. A successful auction will require the FCC to get 2 parts of the equation correctly: the broadcast side and the broadband side. Now, for broadcasters, the intent of the law could not be more clear. For those that plan to exit the market, the FCC has an obligation to let the market work. I'm concerned the Commission seems to be contemplating inserting its judgment for that of the market when it comes to placing a value on a broadcast license. For the incentive auction to be successful, broadcasters that participate should be assured that they will be compensated based on the market value of their licenses as determined by the auction, not based on estimates by the FCC. The auction is voluntary, and we should look askance at FCC policies that would dissuade participation. Now, for those that remain in the business of broadcasting, I've been equally clear what I believe is needed, and the statute is clear what they deserve is certainty. Broadcasters should be assured they will be able to remain viable following the auction. That means the Commission must provide the certainty that broadcasters in the border states will not be interfered with by our neighbors to the north and south. But beyond the statutory requirements, it means the FCC should take into consideration the unique challenges across the country as they reclaim broadcast spectrum and repack existing channels. For example, although ineligible to participate in the auction, low-power translators play a unique role in states in the Mountain West. The Commission should consider the ongoing need for translators as they conduct their repacking analysis. On the broadband side of the equation, the Commission should carefully consider how best to promote participation in the auction in a way that is consistent with the Communications Act. Ultimately, a successful auction will be dependent on both broadcast and broadband interest. The FCC would be wise to recognize that in an industry as competitive as commercial wireless, rarely does the industry speak with a single voice. That's why I'm encouraged that a large portion of the industry and broadcasters seems to be coalescing around a band plan that promotes competition and maximizes auction proceeds. So I'd like to have seen the FCC focus on these aspects in their recent public notice on band plans. Finally, I'd like to talk for just a moment about the auction participation. Just like the broadcasters, potential broadband licensees should be courted as participants and not subjected to economic manipulations at the hands of the FCC. As we have learned time and again in spectrum auctions, well-meaning FCCs have tried to place conditions on auctions in an effort to engineer what it deemed a pro-competitive outcome. Recently, some have suggested the FCC can place restrictions on auction participation without any adverse effect on auction proceeds. It would be folly at best for the FCC to think that it could know better than a true market-based auction the maximum amount the auction could raise. Carefully crafted auction that recognizes the value of participation and has the humility to let the market decide the value of spectrum will best serve all the goals of the legislation. So our witnesses today represent the many sides of this debate: broadcasters that want to sell and broadcasters that want to broadcast, 2 of our nation's 4 largest wireless providers, a representative of the public interest community, and the Federal Communications Commission. While our witnesses may not see eye to eye on all the issues we'll discuss, I look forward to your testimony. I've read it, and your counsel as we all work together on this. And I know that we share a desire to see a successful broadcast incentive auction. I thank you all for being here today. I would yield the balance of my time to the Vice Chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Lapp.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this very important hearing today. Spectrum has been a priority for this subcommittee over the past several years, and it is incumbent upon Congress to exercise oversight over the incentive auction. The Spectrum Act passed as part of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act in 2011 was landmark legislation with the authorization of the Broadcast Spectrum Incentive Auction. The success of this auction, which will be the most complicated the world has ever seen, is absolutely critical for bringing more spectrum to the market and for mobile broadband, as well as for funding our nationwide public safety broadband network. There is no question that success hinges on the incentive auction's design. I look forward to hearing from each of our distinguished witnesses on the incentive auction implementation and the benefits or consequences of the certain auction designs. I look forward to the testimony and as we continue this very critical dialogue. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of my colleagues and to those that are testifying today. As former FCC Chairman McDowell wisely stated last year, the upcoming voluntary incentive auction will, quote, literally be the most complex spectrum auction in world history. To drive new investment, create jobs, and spark a new era of wireless broadband, we need to make sure this auction is done right the first time. We have to get this right. We all know the storyline by now. Consumer demand for wireless broadband continues to skyrocket. More than half of all Americans now own a smartphone, and as the number of wireless devices increases, so has data consumption. Last year alone, mobile devices in the U.S. downloaded more than 1.4 trillion megabits of data. That's nearly 4 times more demand than in 2010. And 2010 was not all that long ago. As the FCC structures its auction rules and band plan to meet this growth, there are 2 areas that deserve enhanced attention. First, with a rare opportunity to auction beachfront spectrum under 1 gigahertz, we must promote a competitive wireless landscape in which carriers of all sizes, both regional and national, have an opportunity to bid competitively for licensed spectrum. Today, in the top 10 U.S. markets, the 2 largest wireless carriers control 86% of all beachfront spectrum below 1 gigahertz. As the Department of Justice observed earlier this year, an auction that protects and promotes a healthy, competitive wireless marketplace enhances consumer choice and serves the public good. Consistent with statute, the FCC should heed this advice by developing rules that promote competition and broad carrier participation. Second, the FCC should structure a band plan that ensures a nationwide block of spectrum under 1 gigahertz dedicated for unlicensed innovation. The economic benefits of such an expansion are well documented, with recent studies concluding that the unlicensed wireless sector contributes between $50 and $100 billion per year to the U.S. economy. That's with a B. That's not million, that's billion. Just this month, West Virginia University became the first university in the country to use TV white spaces to deliver wireless broadband service across the campus. Following on the successes of Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and RFID, the upcoming incentive auction can provide a unique opportunity to fuel a new generation of unlicensed technologies supporting rural broadband, connected hospitals, smart grid networking, and so much more. So I thank all of the witnesses that are here today to share your perspectives. I look forward to your testimony, and that will support our subcommittee's ongoing oversight. And I don't know, where's the clock? Are we? With that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Mr. Doyle.
I thank my friend. This is a critical time for the future of competition in the wireless marketplace. Large carriers currently hold over 80% of the licenses for spectrum below 1 gigahertz. This spectrum provides the best in-building coverage, something that's crucial in urban areas like many parts of my district in Pittsburgh. The increasing disparity in carrier spectrum assets, which the Department of Justice and the Commission have both recognized, presents significant risks such as slowing innovation, stifling price and service competition. If we're going to ensure a more competitive mobile services marketplace, the Commission must ensure that all carriers have the opportunity to acquire high-quality spectrum to meet the skyrocketing demand for mobile broadband services. In the Spectrum Act we passed last year, we specifically preserved the Commission's authority to adopt and enforce rules concerning spectrum aggregation that promote competition. Holdings of lower band spectrum are already dangerously concentrated. I hope the FCC uses its authority to prevent further concentration in this upcoming incentive auction. With that, I yield back my time and thank my colleague and friend, Ms. Eshoo.
Mr. Chairman, may I just submit something for the record? This is a letter from a broad coalition of Fortune 100 companies, rural wireless carriers, and small businesses who believe every wireless carrier should have a fair opportunity to compete in the upcoming auction.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yield back her time. Turn now to the Vice Chair of the full committee, Ms. Blackburn from Tennessee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank each of you for being here. And I have to tell you, we all have questions, and we're looking forward to having your feedback today as we look at what we think is a pretty important issue, and that is the spectrum auctions. There are questions that are unanswered regarding both the policy and the process. We are hoping that we can clear up some of those. We think the law is clear, and if we follow the law, then we're going to have a successful auction, and if we don't, I think that we're pretty much guaranteed to fail. It's important for us to keep in mind also that going through the spectrum auction process, this is not a science fair project. And we want to make certain that we do our due diligence. This is going to be a complicated process, and it doesn't mean the FCC should exclude participants in order to show favoritism to certain telecommunication competitors. Gerrymandering the auctions, particularly the below 1 gigahertz level, to give regulatory favor to some competitors at the expense of those who've earned their success, puts all the work that we have done up to this point at risk. It violates the law, and it also threatens our ability to stand up the public safety network, to provide revenue for deficit reduction, and to find a repacking solution. So we're going to have a lot of questions for you today. Again, I thank you all for being here, and we look forward to proceeding in an orderly manner. And I yield back, I will yield time to Mr. Long, Ms. Elmers, whomever is.
If either of you seek time. If not,
If I'm seeking time, then I will yield back.
yield back. Chair now recognizes former chairman of the committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we continue our oversight of the FCC implementation of the Public Safety and Spectrum Act that Congress passed last year with strong bipartisan support. And I want to thank Chairman Walden for working with us to assemble an outstanding panel of witnesses. We're delighted to have you all here. We'll hear divergent views today on how the auction should be implemented, but equally strong, we'll hear agreement that we have a need to make this groundbreaking auction a success. When Congress enacted this landmark legislation, we knew that implementation would be challenging. The FCC quickly retained a group of world-class experts to help design the complex spectrum auction, and the FCC staff immediately started working around the clock to get this right. And I want to thank the dozens of FCC staffers who have worked so hard to address the challenges posed by this auction. In my view, the success of the auction will be measured by how well we meet the goals laid out by the law. Congress enacted the law with multiple goals in mind: to help relieve the spectrum crunch and to meet the exploding demand of wireless data, to raise revenue to fund multiple public priorities, including the creation of the broadband network for first responders, or FirstNet, to promote competition in the wireless marketplace, and to spur continued innovation, such as the creation of new super Wi-Fi services. The law we passed reflects all of these goals. To promote competition, the law expressly preserves the ability of the FCC to establish limits on spectrum aggregation where necessary to ensure competition. To promote innovation, the law called for the establishment of nationwide guard bands that can be used for unlicensed use. Not surprisingly, some parties are now engaged in revisionist history, suggesting that the FCC has less authority than the statute provides. Others are trying to erect straw men, arguing that proponents of a competitive auction want to exclude AT&T and Verizon from bidding. No party that I am aware of is urging the FCC to exclude the biggest wireless companies from participating in the auction. In fact, my own view is that both companies should be able to compete in the auction. But it makes no sense to allow the two biggest companies with an already dominant market position to acquire all of this high-quality beachfront spectrum. The Justice Department wrote the FCC earlier this year to emphasize how important it is for competition and consumers that this low-band spectrum not be dominated by the two big carriers. These expert views from the Antitrust Division deserve careful consideration. Others have challenged the creation of guard bands, but guard bands are important to enhance the value of the spectrum being auctioned and to create spectrum that can be used for the next generation of Wi-Fi services. The FCC's job will not be easy, but the goals in the statute are the right ones and they are all achievable. With carefully designed rules, the FCC can make new spectrum available to wireless carriers, raise the revenue needed for FirstNet, and promote competition and innovation. Our job should be to resist the importuning of special interests and help the FCC make this groundbreaking auction a historic success. I look forward to the testimony of our distinguished witnesses, and I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put two documents in the record. One is a letter from public interest groups, Public Knowledge, the New America Foundation, the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Free Press, and the Writers Guild of America in support of pro-consumer limitations on spectrum concentration as part of the auction of the 600 megahertz band by the FCC.
Without objection.
And the second is to enter into the record an ex parte by the U.S. Department of Justice concluding that the rules for the 600 megahertz auctions are necessary to ensure competition in the wireless market.
Without objection. Be entered
Thank you,
in the
Mr.
record.
Chairman. Yields back to balance.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Now we'll turn to our distinguished panel of witnesses who have agreed to provide us with great testimony and counsel today. We appreciate you all being here. We're going to start with Gary Epstein, who is the Senior Advisor and co-lead of the Incentive Auction Task Force of the Federal Communications Commission, the man who has the biggest weight on his shoulders to do it all right, make it all work. Mr. Epstein, thanks for the work you're doing for the country at the FCC, and we look forward to your comments today, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo and members of the subcommittee. My name is Gary Epstein. I'm the Senior Advisor and Chair of the Federal Communications Commission Incentive Auction Task Force. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Commission's efforts to carry out Congress's statutory direction in designing and implementing the broadcast television spectrum incentive auction. In our effort to design and implement the incentive auction, the Commission is guided by four primary public interest objectives. One, relieving the spectrum crunch by creating a market-based process for repurposing the maximum amount of UHF spectrum for licensed and unlicensed flexible use to address the expected growth in mobile data usage, which is predicted to grow by a factor of 9 by 2017. Two, fulfilling our statutory obligations and congressional objectives that include reimbursing repack broadcasters, funding FirstNet, and deficit reduction. 3, providing a unique financial opportunity for participating broadcasters while preserving a healthy broadcast services for those who choose not to contribute their spectrum. And 4, promoting the innovation in a vibrant mobile market. As we pursue these objectives, we're focused on both the engineering and economics issues and are drawing on the expertise of the world's leading economists, auction design experts, and engineers, both inside and outside the agency. We're engaging with all interested parties in an open and transparent process in which we will learn from the robust public record we are building, aim for simplicity, and adjust our proposals as necessary to ensure that the auction succeeds. With respect to process, it's also important to remember we're in the middle of an open proceeding and the Commission has made no final determinations. The staff's role in the incentive auction proceeding, under the direction of the Commission, is to conduct as comprehensive and exhaustive an examination of the full range of policy options as practicable in order to best advise the Commission. Ultimately, within the bounds of the statute, it is the Commission that will determine the design of the incentive auction. The Commission has moved swiftly since Congress passed the Spectrum Act. A guiding principle has been to get it done on time and get it done right. Under Acting Chairwoman Clyburn, the staff has continued our steady progress towards a 2013 report and order and a 2014 auction. In the first 6 months after the Act was passed, the Commission quickly formed a cross-agency task force, retained auction design experts, adopted a channel sharing order, and officially launched the proceeding by adopting a comprehensive and specific notice of proposed rulemaking. Since adopting the notice, we've hosted several workshops and participated in numerous industry conferences, both to inform the public about the proceeding and solicit input on distinct incentive auction design issues. To date, we've had workshops on channel sharing, reimbursement for relocation costs, auction design, the band plan, and the notice itself. In addition, in the interest of public engagement and an open, transparent, and participatory process, the Commissioners and staff have participated in over 180 incentive auction-related events and meetings since the enactment of the Spectrum Act, including numerous discussions with our colleagues in Canada and Mexico. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the task force has met with each of my fellow panelists numerous times to discuss their particular views with respect to the auction. Since the notice, we've also released several public notices on issues we believe warranted further consideration and opportunity for interested parties to provide additional input. To date, we've received and considered over 460 comments and reply comments to incentive auction public notices. Our public notices have solicited input on interference calculation software, band plan design, and in the case of a public notice we released just yesterday, the repacking process. Yesterday's release includes the results of a preliminary analysis of whether any particular television station could be assigned or reassigned to particular channels in the incentive auction repacking process, consistent with statutory and other requirements. Each public notice we have issued has proven critical to advancing the proceeding, and we expect that yesterday's release, which was only the first of several public notices we expect to issue regarding repacking, will allow interested parties to better understand some of our preliminary efforts in developing a repacking methodology and elicit valuable comments on our proposals. Finally, we're committed to an open, transparent, and inclusive process. On several issues, it appears there is emerging some agreement on how to move forward. On other issues, stakeholders appear to be coming to general agreement on the surface, but there remain differences of opinion in the details. And on some important topics, there remain divergent positions. The key for the Commission is to continue to solicit and carefully review ideas from the experts, both outside and within the Commission, to enable the Commission to make the hard decisions based upon the best available data and ideas. The Incentive Auction Task Force will make recommendations to the full Commission that we believe will result in an auction that will serve the public interest and achieve the objectives and goals Congress laid out in the Spectrum Act. The ideas we put forth for the Commissioners to consider will be based on substantial and valuable input from the public. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Epstein, thank you. And again, thank you for what you and your team are doing to try and get this right and get it on time. So we appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We're going to go now to the Senior Vice President of Public Knowledge, Mr. Harold Feld. We appreciate your being back before our subcommittee to testify, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo. Thank you for inviting me here to testify today. 2 years ago, I testified before the subcommittee that a properly structured incentive auction could be a rare public policy trifecta, a win-win-win that provided more licensed spectrum, more efficient access to unlicensed spectrum in this extremely useful set of frequencies, in addition to raising revenue for an interoperable public safety network now called FirstNet. The auction of licenses in this band for mobile broadband could also enhance competition to the benefit of consumers. At the same time, while reallocation of a portion of the TV band from broadcasting to licensed wireless service would mean the loss of spectrum for white spaces in some areas, it raised the possibility of creating more access in crowded urban markets. Through the reallocation of the spectrum and subsequent repacking of the remaining broadcasters, the FCC could create a national unlicensed band that would encourage developers to build new devices and offer more innovative services that take advantage of the unique properties of these frequencies. The last 2 years have proved both the importance of unlicensed access, especially in the TV bands, and the importance of stimulating competition on the licensed side. In this time period, we have seen the cable industry recognize the value of offering unlicensed access as a supplement for their broadband networks. Ad hoc unlicensed networks proved their value in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. We now talk of carrier-grade Wi-Fi as a critical tool for the wireless industry. Wireless ISPs are using unlicensed spectrum, including TV white spaces, to bring affordable broadband to rural America. We have also seen the value of regulatory steps to promote competition. In 2011, the FCC imposed data roaming rules, and with the Department of Justice jointly blocked the effort of AT&T to acquire T-Mobile. In 2012, they pushed Verizon to divest spectrum to competitors as part of its acquisition of Spectrum Co. licenses. As a result, we have seen more investment in the wireless market in the last year than we had for many years before. Billions of dollars of new investment flowed into the market as both T-Mobile and Sprint attracted new interest. These revitalized competitors have offered new equipment plans and service plans, and in response, AT&T and Verizon have redoubled their efforts to deploy 4G LTE networks as rapidly as possible and respond with their own new pricing plans. In short, competition works and needs to be preserved. All of this highlights the importance of getting rules for this incentive auction right. The Department of Justice has identified access to low-band spectrum as critical for competition. This spectrum is highly valued for its propagation qualities, its ability to travel long distances and penetrate buildings and trees. Companies looking to invest in unlicensed, such as Comcast, Google, and Microsoft, have likewise identified the broadcast band as critical for developing the next generation of unlicensed services. What does getting it right mean? First, it means we must stop creating false choices and pushing the FCC to choose sides. Congress passed a compromise bill that gave the FCC authority to use the auction to enhance unlicensed and promote competition, but within limits. We should collectively embrace this compromise rather than refighting old battles. The priorities of this auction must work together, not push against each other and fly apart. Second, we need to respect the FCC staff as they work through this difficult process. We cannot have the transparency and trust we need if people unhappy with the substance of staff choices browbeat them over procedure. We should recognize that well-structured guard bands will both provide adequate spectrum for unlicensed use and increase the value of the service as a whole. This is not about artificially inflating guard bands to the point where it would undermine the licensed service. This is about being mindful to achieve all our goals. Instead of setting this up as a false choice where every megahertz of guard band is seen as lost revenue, we should recognize that well-structured guard bands will serve the interests of licensed and unlicensed users alike. Finally, we need to make sure that we have enough participation in the auction to make it worth holding. The best way to ensure that enough bidders show up is what we call a no piggies rule. Don't ban anyone from the auction, but limit the number of licenses that any one company can win. Opponents of a no piggies rule argue that we need to have AT&T and Verizon in the auction. That's true, but the beauty of the no piggies rule is it lets AT&T and Verizon participate. It just makes sure there are enough licenses to make it worthwhile for competitors to show up as well. An auction with only AT&T and Verizon will be just as much a failure as an auction that banned AT&T and Verizon. To conclude, key to a successful incentive auction is a balanced approach. We get there by continuing our current deliberative process. we can still achieve a public policy trifecta, a win-win-win for mobile broadband, competition, and unlicensed access, and build an interoperable public safety net that we all need. It would be a shame to miss this chance by fighting old battles instead of working together. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Feld, thank you for your testimony. We'll now go to Mr. Rick Kaplan, who's the Executive Vice President, Strategic Planning at the National Association of Broadcasters. Mr. Kaplan, welcome back. We look forward to your testimony as well.
Good morning, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me on behalf of the National Association of Broadcasters to testify before you today. NAB is committed to lending its expertise to the subcommittee and the FCC to ensure the successful completion of the world's first ever broadcast incentive auction to the benefit of American consumers, the U.S. Treasury, and public safety. A properly run auction is also critical to the future of the nation's broadcast industry. Now, a casual observer of today's hearing might be led to believe that the upcoming incentive auction is primarily a wireless industry issue. He or she will hear about licensed and unlicensed spectrum, spectrum aggregation limits, and the drive to maximize the amount of spectrum freed up by paying handsomely private equity funds and others on the fringes of broadcasting to relinquish spectrum. The reality, however, is that the industry on which this auction will have the greatest impact is the broadcast industry. To offer some perspective, according to OSTP and the National Economic Council, the U.S. commercial wireless industry will soon control more than 660 megahertz of spectrum, more than any other commercial enterprise, and well more than its counterparts in nearly every other country. This amount is more than double the spectrum allocated to the broadcast industry, and that's before the incentive auction. In fact, a wildly successful incentive auction will likely contribute less than 15% of new spectrum to the wireless industry's overall stockpile. By contrast, this auction will leave an indelible mark on the broadcast industry. Some 30% of the channels on which broadcasters operate will be gone, and we will have to relocate upwards of 50% of the stations that remain on the air. Moreover, potential changes to our coverage areas could greatly impair the ability of a significant number of the nearly 60 million Americans who rely exclusively on over-the-air television to receive the local stations they count on most. Our goal at NAB is to help those broadcasters who remain on the air continue to have the same opportunities to serve the American people they had prior to the auction. The opportunity for the station in Boston to offer wall-to-wall coverage of the terrifying bombings, the opportunity for the tri-state area station to help direct local residents to life-saving services during Hurricane Sandy, and the opportunity for the station in Oklahoma to warn its viewers about the path of deadly tornadoes. Some have described this auction as a win-win-win, although with the final victory being awarded to the broadcasters. To be candid, from what we have seen so far, we'll be lucky to escape with a tie. In any event, to avoid a loss for the broadcast industry, the FCC must ensure three things. First, broadcasters who remain on the air should not be harmed by the voluntary auction. The Spectrum Act dictates that broadcasters must be able to serve the same coverage area and same viewers they did the day after the auction as they did the day before. The FCC should not, for example, move the goalposts by altering the formula by which they calculate these coverage areas. No harm also means that the FCC should not force remaining broadcasters to go out of pocket for reasonable expenses when they are forced to move to make way for the wireless industry. The Commission must treat the TV Broadcaster Relocation Fund as its relocation budget. If not, broadcasters could face significant costs associated with moves they never sought and that offer them no benefits whatsoever. Second, the Commission must develop a band plan that avoids interference between broadcasters and wireless operators. The engineering behind the FCC staff's variable plan has not yet been vetted in an open forum, and the time has come to put the staff's engineering assumptions to the test. As we know from experience, post-auction interference problems take far longer to fix than if they had been addressed openly, transparently, and thoroughly up front. For the same reason, it is essential that the FCC complete international coordination prior to the auction and repacking. An unfinished product leaves the Commission with far less revenue and also forces the Commission into a jagged variable band plan where it has to match broadcast and wireless services in an unprecedented manner across the northern third of the nation. Third, despite the fact that low-power television and TV translators are not formally protected in the statute, the Commission must nevertheless do all it can to preserve these critical services. As last week's letter signed by 57 House members representing rural and mountainous districts made clear, and I'd like to submit that letter for the record if possible.
Without objection.
Translators are an indispensable means by which rural communities, especially out west, receive their free over-the-air news, weather, and emergency information. Also, at a time where the Commission and many members of Congress have expressed concerns about diversity in media ownership and programming, low-power television provides one important answer. If the Commission repacks too aggressively, literally thousands of translators and many more low-power television stations will disappear and never return. In closing, the NAB continues to vigorously support the voluntary, market-based incentive auction authorized by Congress and to see it conducted as expeditiously as possible. But we must also remember that getting it done right is more important than simply getting it done right now. Our aim is to preserve a healthy and robust broadcast industry and to continue to serve our local communities in a way that no other service can duplicate. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kaplan. We appreciate your counsel. Now we'll turn to Preston Padden, the Executive Director, Expanding Opportunities for Broadcasters Coalition. Mr. Padden, welcome back. We look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo and members of the subcommittee. My name is Preston Padden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Expanding Opportunities for Broadcasters Coalition of more than 70 television stations interested in participating in the auction under the right conditions. Chairwoman Clyburn has provided great leadership in moving this auction forward. Commissioners Pai and Rosenworcel are very constructively engaged in these auction issues. Auction Chair Gary Epstein, Bureau Chiefs Ruth Milkman, Bill Lake, and Julius Knapp are working diligently to develop recommendations for the auction design and rules. We are cheerleaders for this auction. In 2014, the FCC can reallocate the full 120 megahertz in the National Broadband Plan, even in the largest markets, as we would be happy to demonstrate in detail to the committee staff. The number one challenge facing the FCC is to make sure that payments to broadcasters are sufficiently large to induce a substantial number of TV spectrum sellers to participate in the auction. If a large number of TV stations offer to sell their spectrum, the FCC will succeed in reallocating 120 megahertz and in raising the revenues necessary to pay the selling TV stations, pay the repacking expenses of non-participating stations, fully fund FirstNet, and contribute to deficit reduction. If an insufficient number of TV spectrum sellers participate, the auction will fail at its inception, and there will be no need to debate other issues such as band plans and wireless carrier eligibility. All TV stations enjoy a range of attractive alternatives other than participating in the incentive auction. To be sure, economists and lawyers easily could construct rules and auction designs such as scoring stations and weighting the auction that would have the effect of limiting payments to potential TV spectrum sellers. But this would lead to less spectrum being offered, less spectrum being reallocated, and less revenue being generated. Prominent legislators of both parties have expressed their concerns about counterproductive proposals to diminish incentives. On March 13th, Chairman Walden issued a statement noting, quote, "Without broadcasters, there is no spectrum to auction," and adding, quote, "It would be foolhardy to limit the incentives from the get-go." On June 4, the Chairman Emeritus of the full committee, Congressman Dingell, wrote a letter asking the FCC to estimate the effect of scoring and weighted auctions on the number of participating TV spectrum sellers and on the amount of spectrum recovered. The FCC will be buying spectrum, not TV station businesses. Scoring based on characteristics of the station is irrelevant to the auction, and the statute authorizes the FCC to pay stations based on competitive bidding, not based on scoring. Finally, as we understand the FCC's likely auction design, it will freeze those stations with the greatest clearing and repacking impact at high-priced early rounds of the auctions, while stations with lesser clearing and repacking impact continue to descend to lower-priced rounds, thereby automatically paying more to the stations most important to the FCC's clearing goal. Simply put, the FCC should offer the same high initial prices to all stations in the same market and rely on the statutorily prescribed auction to discipline final prices.
We urge the Commission to provide broadcasters with more information about auction design and rules. If there are border markets where the FCC cannot recover 120 megahertz at this time, we support a variable band plan to avoid a lowest common denominator limitation on nationwide spectrum recovery. The FCC should allow stations to channel share with any other station in their DMA and to change their city of license to match the host sharing partner. The FCC should continue its productive discussions with Mexico and Canada without making the final conclusion of those discussions an obstacle to holding the auction in 2014, just as the FCC previously has conducted other auctions without final resolution of border issues. Finally, the clear congressional priorities of funding FirstNet and making a dent in the deficit militate against restricting participation in this auction by any wireless carrier. We need robust competition among all wireless carriers to assure that the auction produces the maximum revenues possible. Concerns about market concentration should be left to another proceeding on another day when they may well have been obviated by the recent dramatic marketplace strengthening of Sprint and T-Mobile. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Padden, thank you for your testimony. We'll now move to Kathleen Ham, who's the Vice President, Federal Regulatory Affairs of T-Mobile. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Kathleen O'Brien Ham, and I am the Vice President for Federal Regulatory at T-Mobile US. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. T-Mobile is the fourth largest wireless carrier, serving about 43 million subscribers and employing 38,000 people in the U.S. Since the government blocked our merger with AT&T 18 months ago, we've been reinvigorating our brand and our network. Earlier this year, we announced our Un-carrier strategy, setting us apart from our larger competitors. We dropped traditional price plans in favor of affordable simple choice plans. We said there's no need for annual service contracts anymore. We gave customers the option to bring their own device or buy one from us interest-free. We launched Jump, so customers can upgrade their phones when they want, not when they are told. These innovative moves are putting pressure on our larger competitors, who are now copying our offers. That's what healthy competition achieves. On top of all this, we're rolling out our 4G LTE at a record-shattering pace. The upcoming incentive auction is critical to the future of wireless competition. Spectrum is the air we breathe. Without it, we cannot compete and we cannot innovate. The FCC should maximize the amount of spectrum auctioned for mobile use. More spectrum is good for competition and good for auction revenues. Plain and simple. We commend the Commission for its ongoing work to develop auction rules. To ensure the rules promote competition and consumer choice, the FCC should consider three critical objectives. First, encourage broadcaster participation to maximize the amount of spectrum auctioned. Second, adopt a 600 megahertz band plan that maximizes auctioning paired spectrum for mobile use. Finally, and most important, adopt reasonable spectrum aggregation limits so the dominant carriers do not foreclose other competitors from this last best opportunity to acquire low-band spectrum. All carriers agree there needs to be competitive limits on spectrum. The only dispute is how and when to employ them. T-Mobile has proposed an overall limit on the amount of low-band spectrum that any carrier can hold. And we have said no carrier would be shut out of the incentive auction in any market, even if they otherwise exceed the limit. Despite what you may be hearing, limits on spectrum concentration are consistent with Congress's 1993 directive to promote competition. It is that visionary law that is the basis of the billions of dollars in investment and the creation of millions of jobs that wireless competition has channeled into the U.S. economy for the past 2 decades. Why do we need reasonable spectrum aggregation limits? 3 reasons. First, All spectrum is not created equal. The 600 megahertz spectrum penetrates buildings, is cheaper to deploy in both rural and certain urban settings. Today, the two largest carriers control about 80% of the spectrum below 1 gigahertz, half of which they got for free from the government in the 1980s. All carriers need a mix of both high and low band spectrum to effectively compete. T-Mobile, even with its good high band spectrum position today, holds no low band spectrum. Second, the two dominant carriers have much to lose from competition. Their market power gives them a significant incentive, an ability to acquire spectrum to block competition. By contrast, T-Mobile and other smaller carriers value spectrum solely based on its use. Without market power, you don't pay more for spectrum than the use value you derive from it, no matter who your shareholders are. In a letter shared with the subcommittee yesterday, smaller and rural carriers joined T-Mobile in calling for low band limits to protect competition. Finally, upfront limits enhance auction revenue. Without them, smaller bidders may decide to sit out the auction or curtail their participation. Without a doubt, this auction will have a critical impact on the competitive future. The right policy choices will foster competition and investment. The wrong choices will move us backward. Thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brian Ham. We appreciate your being here. We now turn to Joan Marsh, who's Vice President, Federal Regulatory Affairs for AT&T. We welcome you here, Ms. Marsh, and please go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Eshoo, for inviting AT&T to join in this very important discussion today. To quote former FCC Chairman Julius Janikowski, this is a big deal. The 600 megahertz auction presents the next best opportunity to reallocate valuable spectrum for wireless broadband use and could be the only one like it for years to come. But this auction is not just about new wireless allocations. It is also about critical public safety goals. There is wide agreement that the auction must generate up to $7 billion to fund construction of the first nationwide interoperable wireless broadband public safety network. Auction revenues will also support broadcaster relocation, public safety research, next-generation 911 services, and much-needed deficit reduction. The importance of these goals has been underscored by both sides of the aisle in letters to the Commission urging them to adopt policies that will enhance the ability of the auction to meet these critical statutory goals. We agree. But success in meeting these goals is by no means a guarantee. This is by far the most complex auction proceeding ever undertaken, and the Commission must persuade two different sets of auction bidders to participate in two separate but interrelated auctions. In the face of this enormous complexity, there are a few key principles that should guide decision-making at every turn. And you'll be happy to hear I agree with two of the principles Ms. Ham expressed today. I would like to discuss, however, one remaining principle in which there is some disagreement. The primary principle is straightforward. Allow free and open participation in the auction by all qualified bidders. This approach is the only one that will maximize auction revenues and thereby maximize the chances for an auction that achieve all of Congress's stated goals. If qualified bidders are excluded or limited in their bidding activity, less spectrum may be relinquished by broadcasters, the spectrum that is offered will sell at lower prices, and the chances of a successful auction will be diminished. Unfortunately, as always in the case of regulatory proceedings of significant import, there are some who want the Commission to game the rules in favor of certain competitors over others. These proposals vary in their specifics, but they share a common theme: restricting AT&T and Verizon from full participation in the auction while steering spectrum to other bidders, including Sprint and T-Mobile, neither of which participated in the last major auction. These proposals are ill-advised as they are unlawful. For starters, we believe they are unnecessary. Sprint already has by far the largest spectrum portfolio of any U.S. wireless provider, vastly exceeding that of both AT&T and Verizon. Indeed, given this, it's by no means certain that Sprint will choose to participate in the 600 megahertz auction. Sprint also has at its disposal substantial new capital resources from its owner, Japanese-based SoftBank, to fund any future spectrum purchases it might choose to make. For its part, T-Mobile is owned by Deutsche Telekom, one of the largest telecommunications companies in the world. It too has recently acquired substantial amounts of new spectrum, including from AT&T, Verizon, and the former Metro PCS. In fact, T-Mobile now runs ads in the marketplace claiming that its network is less congested and provides greater capacity than does AT&T's. In short, there is no basis upon which to conclude that Sprint or T-Mobile have a greater need to win spectrum at this auction than any other bidder. More importantly, to the extent these carriers choose to participate, there is no basis to conclude that they lack the resources to bid competitively and win, absent auction rules that either make it easier or cheaper for them to do so. Conversely, restricting or limiting bidder participation will come at a heavy price. If AT&T and Verizon are restricted or relegated to a separate shadow auction with its own set of rules, spectrum values at auction will be suppressed and revenues reduced. This result would effectively ask U.S. taxpayers to subsidize the auction, undermining the auction's revenue goals, including that of deficit reduction. Such rules could also impact the calculation that broadcasters will make in deciding whether to participate or not. For these reasons, AT&T has urged the Commission to adhere to its statutory mandate and conduct an open and competitive auction that awards spectrum to the highest bidder. This approach is not only consistent with the law, but it would also offer the best prospect for a successful auction that meets all of Congress's goals. My written testimony includes comments in other areas of great interest to AT&T, including the band plan, the need to get the engineering right, the efforts of the industry to find consensus, and the role unlicensed services can play in this auction. As to broadcaster participation, AT&T believes that broadcasters who come to the auction table are not selling a broadcast business. They are relinquishing their rights to 6 megahertz of spectrum, much needed for mobile wireless use. Any valuation mechanism adopted in the reverse auction should be consistent with that reality, and opening prices should be set at a level that will encourage participation. In conclusion, this auction presents enormous opportunity and risk. The stakes are as high as the issues are complex. AT&T remains confident that under the able leadership of Chairwoman Clyburn, Commissioners Pai and Rosenworcel, and Commission staff led by Mr. Epstein, the FCC will adopt auction rules that maximize participation and prospects for a successful auction with all the intended benefits envisioned by Congress. And before I conclude, one comment on something Ms. Ham said. She indicated that we got a lot of our low-band spectrum for free. That is incorrect. Although the 850 allocations were originally allocated to incumbents, those licenses have changed hands many times in the secondary market, and the vast majority of AT&T's portfolio of 850 spectrum was purchased in the secondary market, and I can assure you we paid big values for that spectrum. I just wanted to correct that one fact, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ms. Marsh. We appreciate your testimony. And now we'll go to the question phase. So again, we want to thank you all for your testimony today and your counsel. Mr. Epstein, although ineligible to participate in the auction, low-power translators play a unique role in the states, especially in the Mountain West, where thousands of viewers rely exclusively on translators for news and weather and emergency information. Is the FCC considering auction rules and repacking procedures that will minimize the negative impacts the auction will have on TV translators and low-power TV where possible?
Mr. Chairman, the Commission in its notice recognized the public interest concerns that you just stated. The Congress made the decision not to include low power and translators in the incentive auction, but it doesn't mean that they are not highly valued aspects. And yes, in considering the repacking and other aspects of the incentive auction, translators, we asked specific questions about translators and low power. One other point that I'd like to quickly make, and that is in our, and this may be a misapprehension on some people's part, in any of our band plan deliberations, what we're seeking to do is to have a core amount of spectrum across most of the United States. There may be some areas which are impaired because of issues which I'm sure we will discuss, but in rural areas we are not seeking to eke out the last amount of spectrum, and that's especially in recognition of the issue you just stated.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Again, Mr. Epstein and Mr. Kaplan, the Spectrum Act requires the FCC to follow the methodology in OET Bulletin 69 when repacking the broadcast band. But the FCC has released multiple public notices on changes to the software and inputs it intends to use to run the repacking analysis, including the use of new data and assumptions. Mr. Kaplan, do you believe that the proposed changes to the OET 69 software comport with the Act? And Mr. Epstein, why are those changes necessary?
I believe the changes now on the fourth round of changes as of last night are both unlawful and unwise.
Okay, Mr. Epstein, do you have a different view of that?
Yes, I do. I have a different view.
Figured as much.
The statute requires us to maintain the methodology utilized in OET 69. We believe we are maintaining the methodology. What we're looking at is updating the inputs. We're looking at doing such things as using 2010 census instead of 2000 census. Seems to make a lot of sense to us to update the inputs to the software. The original software is just not capable of operating with the incentive auction.
But are you making changes in the methodology?
We are not.
Okay, Mr. Kaplan, why do you think these are unwise, illegal, and whatever else you said?
Well, when I worked at the FCC, when Congress told us to do something, we did it. Those were the easiest times when it was very clear. Congress made it very clear as to what the FCC should do. There's a very simple methodology, actually it's very complicated for most of us, but for engineers, very simple, about how to go about calculating our coverage areas. Congress was wise to not allow the FCC to move the goalposts, mostly to create certainty, which you talked about in your opening statement, about what broadcasters will participate, what won't, and where we might cover. As we did our analysis on the changes that are occurring in OET 69, they become wildly inaccurate. We get different results each run we do, and they surprisingly or unsurprisingly shrink our coverage areas quite a bit in certain areas of the country. And so therefore, we think it runs far afoul of what Congress intended.
All right, we'll follow up on this discussion. Mr. Epstein, the FCC staff has taken the unusual step of freezing not only new but also pending applications by TV stations to modify their viewing areas. Some of these modifications have been pending for years. These mods will allow broadcasters that wish to remain on the air to bring local news, emergency information to a larger audience in their local markets. Is the Commission considering any kind of analysis to determine whether some can be granted without disrupting the incentive auction? And Mr. Kaplan, do you know of an approach that would prevent the mods from making the repacking process more difficult?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we are analyzing the station applications that are pending. Just 2 sentences worth of background. Congress in the statute set a specific date for applications to be considered in the repacking. These applications were either pending or not granted by that date. The FCC found in its notice it had the discretion to grant them, but put a temporary freeze in place so we can analyze them.
But you are in that process of
We
analysis?
are in that
Because I would think there would be some markets, as you described, where
we've also
it
asked.
wouldn't be a
We've
problem.
also put in place a waiver request for a particular hardship. So the answer to your question is yes, we are analyzing those stations.
Mr. Kaplan, you care to comment?
Anytime you freeze, and this goes for any industry, you freeze an industry from acting, you freeze investment, and you freeze any outside investment, especially in that industry. And that's what's going on right now in the broadcast industry. We've actually proposed another solution, perhaps, that we hope the FCC would adopt, which is, I think, and everyone can agree, might help the process in general, which is to move forward on this portion of the incentive auction order, not wait for issues like ban plan, competition, other things, but actually adopt an order making the decisions that are of things that are proposed in the notice of proposed rulemaking on these issues. Therefore, you won't have a need for a freeze because the FCC will then have decided where they come down on what stations are protected and what stations aren't, and we would fully support that.
Mr. Epstein, did you want to comment?
Just briefly, and this is an overriding comment. Anything that I say with respect to recommendations ultimately has to be acted on by the Commission.
Sure.
What the staff does is make recommendations to the Commission, and the Commission is the actual decision maker here. We are analyzing stations. What we're concerned about is in a complicated process like the incentive auction, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves and make decisions which we may regret later, which will significantly affect our repacking. So we're doing exactly as Mr. Kaplan said. We're trying to determine whether these stations will have any effect on repacking.
All right. Appreciate your answers to my questions. We'll now turn to the gentlelady from California, the ranking member, Ms. Eshoo, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each one of you. I think that this is not only a very important panel, but your testimony is, I mean, we're hanging on every word that each one of you are saying. Obviously, differences between you. I want to go to Ms. Marsh first, and there's something that's really bothering me about this, as Mr. Waxman said, a straw man being set up, that there are those that want to exclude or seeking to have AT&T and Verizon excluded from this process. There isn't anyone that has suggested that. I haven't found that. I've tried Googling it. I've asked my staff to research it. There isn't anyone that has suggested that or is for that. And I think I heard a suggestion that if this isn't set up the way you want it, that AT&T is simply not going to participate, which I think is a threat that unless it goes exactly the way you want it, the entire auction is going to fail, that we won't be able to reduce the deficit, we won't produce the dollars for the interoperable nationwide public safety network, and the auction won't be successful. Are you actually stating that if you don't get your way, that you're just not going to participate?
No, ma'am, and I apologize if I suggested that. I certainly did not suggest that AT&T will not participate. But we do believe if there are limitations imposed, even if they now are not exclusions by name, they could act to exclude
So let me
both
just
AT&T
ask you
and
this.
Verizon.
If, in fact, there is not room for competition by smaller carriers, you think that the auction will fail?
No, I believe that the auction can be set up so there's room for all bidders to come and win. And that's exactly what we've seen in the last two major
So
auctions at the FCC.
how Ms. Ham, does that, I think she just said something that may please you.
Yeah. Well, we're in favor of broad participation in the auction. I used to run the Spectrum Auctions program at the FCC, and I ran the early PCS auctions, and I saw what a successful auction looked like. Successful auction is one where you have a lot of bidders bidding in a lot of markets, okay? That's what T-Mobile would like to see in this auction. That's what we think will be accomplished with reasonable spectrum aggregation limits. As you indicated, we and others are not saying exclude AT&T and Verizon. What we're worried about, and bear in mind, we're not even sure how much spectrum there's going to be in this auction. It all really depends on what broadcasters
Voluntary.
show up.
Right.
And if there's less spectrum here, there is a much greater likelihood that AT&T and Verizon can divide and conquer, okay? So to Harold's no piggies rule, I think that's what we're talking about.
I was waiting for someone to bring that up
Yeah.
on the panel.
I think what we're talking
I think
about
Ms. Marsh would, but anyway.
is ensuring that there's competition after this auction. The FCC hasn't run an auction in 5 years. This is the most important auction that they've run since the PCS auctions. Back then, there was a duopoly. There was a cellular duopoly. And guess what the Commission did? The Commission put in place reasonable aggregation limits. T-Mobile stands here today as a competitor because of that good policy. That's what we're for.
Thank you. To Mr. Epstein, this is just a curiosity question. Do you think that the FCC will meet its goal of holding the auction in 2014?
What our charge is from Chairwoman Clyburn is for the staff to do whatever it can to place the options before the Commission to adopt a report and order in 2013 and to hold the auction in 2014. That's what we plan and intend to do.
Do you have confidence that it can happen in 2014, though?
Whether it happens in 2014, I guess, is above my pay grade. But we will do everything we can to empower the Commission to make that decision and to hold the auction.
You're a wonderful diplomat. I think everyone in this room knows that how strongly I feel about unlicensed spectrum. You know, the fight to get that into the spectrum bill. I think a real victory for the country that we did, and that we continue on that path to not only protect it but enlarge it. In 2011, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, it's known at home as CEPR, it's a very important organization at Stanford, looked at the economic benefits of unlicensed and concluded that making more of it available would, quote, likely add significantly to government revenue and could result in higher auction revenue than if all new bandwidth were sold under exclusive licenses. Mr. Feld, do you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely. We've seen historically every time that we have, added more unlicensed spectrum and made that more available, it has just led to a fantastic boom in new services and new devices that produce exciting new economic opportunities. In 89 rather, when we first went to garage door openers. In 97, we opened up the UNII band, which laid the groundwork for Wi-Fi and all of the innovations that has brought. With TV white spaces in only the short time that it has actually been available for us to certify equipment, we've got a huge backlog of orders among WISPs. We're seeing other countries in Europe. We're seeing Kenya and South Africa and New Zealand all looking at this technology with pilot projects popping up all over the world. This is just a fantastic engine of not just innovation, but also of economic opportunity and growth.
Thank you very much. And I have other questions, Mr. Chairman, but I'll submit them to the witnesses. Is there a time frame in which witnesses need to respond to us when we submit questions to them?
7 days.
I don't know the answer to that one.
10 days.
10 days.
10 days? Good. Okay. Thank you very much.
The lady's time has expired, and the chair recognizes the lady from Tennessee, the vice chair lady, Representative Blackburn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I thank you all for being here. I have to tell you, it is interesting to hear such a spirited conversation. And I think that we all appreciate this, and I hope we're all focused on the same goal, and that is getting this spectrum out to the marketplace so that we don't end up with a spectrum crisis. Ms. Ham, I want to come to you because I know that you all have been running an ad that claims that your network is less congested than AT&T's.
Mm-hmm.
And then I saw a Deutsche Bank financial statement that said Sprint is the new spectrum powerhouse and has more spectrum for LTE than all of its competitors combined. And then you're talking about AT&T being excluded. So if your ads are true, why would you not want AT&T in the spectrum auctions?
Well, again, to clarify, we are not talking about excluding them. And in fact, it helps us to have AT&T and Verizon in our neighborhood, okay? I mean, we were the leaders of building out AWS spectrum. We did that alone, okay? It helps to have your competitors out there buying from vendors and et cetera, brings down the cost of the handset and so forth. So we want them in the neighborhood, okay? That's not what this is about. And, you know, in terms of our ads, none of those ads, I mean, T-Mobile, going back 18 months, I think I referenced since our deal. So we got some spectrum from AT&T as part of that deal, okay? We got some spectrum from Verizon as part of the Verizon Spectrum Co deal, and we recently merged with Metro PCS. So we are in a stronger position than we were 18 months ago with upper band spectrum.
Okay. Then if the sub 1 gigahertz spectrum is so important, then why did T-Mobile, why didn't they even participate in the 700 megahertz auction?
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, with all due respect, I think we have to take the market as it is today, not as it was in 2006. The market has changed dramatically since then. There were barely even smartphones back in 2007. T-Mobile did participate in the 2006 auction, and we very aggressively built that spectrum out. That spectrum was encumbered with 22 federal agencies, okay? We were deep in the throes of that, and I know we visited a lot of your offices during that time about that issue, because clearing the Department of Justice and the Department of Defense is no easy job, okay? So the other thing I will say is we have to take the spectrum in the order we get it, okay? The 700 megahertz auction came after the AWS auction. At the time the AWS auction occurred, T-Mobile was hot to trot to get our 3G spectrum so we could compete with these guys, okay? That was the spectrum that was on the auction block. We put our resources into it, and we put our resources into clearing it. And today we're using that spectrum. We're probably using it the most of anybody. That's our LTE spectrum. So T-Mobile knows how to get its spectrum and use its spectrum, but we don't have any low-band spectrum, and low-band spectrum is what this auction is about.
Okay. Now, Mr. Feld has his hand up, and I'm going to recognize him, even though he has a no piggies rule. And he's trying to hog the time. So, Mr. Feld, I'm going to recognize you for your comments, but then Also, in your written testimony, you were comparing the auction. If AT&T and Verizon were in it, it would be akin to the Boston Celtics trying to play an amateur team. I'm not certain. I think your testimony's a little exaggerated there. And, you know, ask your question, but then I also want to hear you respond. Why do you have so little faith in these wireless providers?
Well, first of all, let me say, I cannot help but think fondly and nostalgically of the '85-'86 Celtics, but that's just a product of growing up in Boston. The issue I just wish to raise was there were many other competitors comparable to T-Mobile and Sprint, both of whom were going through their own internal spectrum issues. T-Mobile buying and clearing AWS, Sprint in the rather horrific 800 megahertz rebanding that participated. They all got beat. Alltel came out with nothing. They had no choice but essentially to exit the field after they came up empty. Leap came up empty. Metro PCS came up practically empty. All of these players came in because when push came to shove, Verizon and AT&T were able to bring the most resources to bear on the licenses that they wanted to have, and nobody else could hope to outbid them. You know, that's what happened in 700 megahertz. And if T-Mobile had been there, they would have gone the same way as Alltel.
My time has expired, but I will just mention for the record, I read a Citibank report and in preparation for this, and I think that Verizon now has less spectrum per million postpaid subscribers than any of you at the table. And so I think we need to be careful about talking about trying to keep people out or restricting the auctions, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back, and at this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I said in my opening statement, Congress enacted this law, the Public Safety and Spectrum Act, with multiple goals in mind. These goals include using auction revenue to fund multiple priorities, such as the creation of the nationwide public safety broadband and network known as FirstNet, as well as ensuring that the wireless marketplace remains competitive after the auction closes. These goals are not mutually exclusive. I want to just ask the panelists, I could ask you all that answer in affirmative, but do any of you think that the FCC is not capable of conducting an auction that advances both of these critical goals? Seeing no one responding, then I'll accept
They are
it.
absolutely capable of doing that.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'd like to ask a hypothetical question. It's a simple hypothetical question of our panelists. Let's assume that the incentive auction clears enough spectrum for the FCC to make available for sale 7 paired spectrum licenses in every market throughout the United States. Should the FCC allow any one bidder to acquire all 7 licenses available in a market? Maybe get a yes or no, Mr. Feld?
No, certainly not.
And Mr. Epstein, do you want to answer that?
Whatever diplomatic skills I exercise with Ranking Member Eshoo, I'd like to exercise again, because we're the initial decision makers on that issue.
Well, I wanted a yes or no, so if you don't feel you can do a yes or no, maybe because we're asking about the FCC, I'll ask the other panelists. Mr. Kaplan, yes or no?
It's not an issue the NAB has taken a position on, but I don't believe anyone on this panel has answered that question. Yes, I think that only one bidder should win. I don't think anyone has answered that.
Okay, and Mr. Padden?
The Congress has asked a great deal of this one small proceeding, and that is to convince enough broadcasters to come in and volunteer their spectrum, to raise enough money to...
But should the FCC allow, under my hypothetical, any one bidder to acquire all 7 licenses, if that's what we have available,
we believe
market?
We believe the priority has to be to maximize the revenue in this market, in this auction, to achieve the public interest goals Congress has set, including
So
funding
you think
FirstNet.
that the FCC should allow it if it maximizes?
We would defer to the market forces of the auction to determine the outcome.
Ms. Ham?
No, I don't think any one bidder should acquire all of it, and I think you can have a healthy competition and maximize the revenue.
Ms. Marsh?
I think that it's highly unlikely, if you look at prior auctions, that that would ever happen. We've always had a diversity of winners, even when auctions were open and free to all participants. And as a backstop to that, the FCC would always retain its general authority over spectrum aggregation. And AT&T has never suggested that general authority would not continue to exist.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask this to Mr. Feld and Ms. Ham. When Congress first granted the FCC the authority to conduct spectrum auctions in 1993, the law included specific instructions about what the Commission must consider to protect the public interest. Under Section 309J of the Communications Act, the FCC is required to promote, quote, economic opportunity and competition, end quote, and ensure that, quote, new and innovative technologies are readily accessible to the American people by avoiding excessive concentration of licenses and by disseminating licenses among a wide variety of applicants, end quote. Furthermore, the statute prohibits the FCC to base a public interest finding solely or predominantly on the expectation of revenues from an auction. Mr. Feld, Ms. Ham, do you think these provisions are equally valid today?
Absolutely. In fact, the Spectrum Act of 2012 explicitly states in Section 6043I that nothing in this subsection shall be construed to expand or contract the authority of the Commission except as otherwise expressly provided. Those provisions remain. They were not explicitly addressed. What was addressed was a methodology in which Congress said the rule by which you implement those things is to say you can't, it must be a rule of general applicability, which is what the Commission has before it today, and those remain not only legal, but we would argue under the statutes that you've cited, necessary.
Ms. Ham, you were
Yes.
there.
Yes, I was
original
there,
auction.
yeah. No, I think those provisions are very wise and valid, and as I indicated before, it's the reason why T-Mobile exists today, and the reason why billions has been invested into this industry, and millions of jobs have been created since that law was enacted. So yes, I think it's wise and it's good public policy.
I want to conclude by asking Mr. Feld, as you know, the Department of Justice filed a letter with the FCC earlier this year in support of spectrum aggregation rules. The department expressed concern that the dominant wireless incumbents may have the incentive to pay foreclosure value to acquire spectrum licenses for the purpose of blocking competition and preventing rivals from improving their competitive position through the acquisition of better spectrum. An article in the Wall Street Journal recently suggested that AT&T's proposal to acquire Leap Wireless is evidence that foreclosure might be a real concern, given that AT&T is willing to spend more than 8 times Leap's 2013 earnings to acquire the carrier. Do you think that the DOJ was correct to raise this concern with the FCC?
I absolutely think this DOJ was correct, particularly with regard to the low-band spectrum, because this is all there is. There is no spectrum fracking that we can use to get low-band spectrum out of spectrum shale. There are no new spectrum mines that could be opened now that the price of low-band spectrum has become more valuable. This is our last chance to get low-band spectrum into the hands of competitors, and therefore there is every incentive for those companies that could block competitors from getting it to do so. Verizon is advertising its low-band spectrum on its LTE network, to borrow Ms. Blackburn's proof. They're advertising that you can get better reception in the woods on a Verizon system using 700 megahertz low-band spectrum. That's really valuable stuff that they expect even the consumers who don't know what a megahertz is to understand. It's incredibly valuable, and we need to make sure competitors have some.
Can I respond on the foreclosure point?
It's up to the chairman, but I certainly would want you to be able to.
Well, the gentleman's time has expired, but if you could make it very, very brief.
Yes, the foreclosure point is fully addressed by the FCC's build requirements. The FCC today and the prior auction and all transactions have very stringent build requirements that require any licensee that acquires spectrum to build it. in very specific time frames or face significant consequences. We think that that completely eliminates any potential threat of buying spectrum simply to foreclose competitors.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired and yields back. And at this time, the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. And again, I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony today. I think it's another outstanding panel that we have here today. And if I could start, Mr. Kaplan, with some of your testimony that you gave today. Just if you get a little more comment on this, if I could just read a little bit. From your page 7, you were talking about in February of this year that the FCC staff presented what the FCC staff believed to be the 7 key components of the voluntary broadcast incentive auction. And you list those 7, but then you say this list is remarkable for the fact that almost a year and a half after passage of the Spectrum Act, the affected industries still have no clear idea how and when the FCC plans to address these key components. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure, thank you. Yes, one concern we have is transparency, and not just transparency for transparency's sake, but transparency and engagement. And that means on the list of 7 that's there, aside from the first one, which actually was mandated by Congress, the options that were available to the FCC for participation by broadcasters, but is bringing people together. And actually, we had a very nice conversation before this hearing, so thank you for bringing this panel together, because I think we've already accomplished some things before the hearing, to work together prior to things coming out to figure out how we, I guess to quote Jerry Maguire, how we can help you. So in other words, we'd love to be of assistance, as I know T-Mobile and AT&T, Harold, Preston, to the Commission. But understanding where they are in the process is enormously important, because otherwise we're shooting in the dark. So all of our comments about transparency are about transparency and engagement. And to Ms. Eshu's point before about the auction in 2014, to get that done, we all need to be engaged. We're ready to do it. We want to do it expeditiously, but not knowing where things stand and then finding out, let's say, the night before a hearing where we might be and then trying to figure out things really quickly is not necessarily a recipe for success. So we're ready to do it, but I think transparency and engagement are central.
Thank you very much. Mr. Epstein, I know this is an issue that's very important to both Chairman Emeritus Dingle and to me because of our districts where we're located. Mr. Dingle's being in Michigan, mine being in Northwest Ohio, and of course with Ontario being our next door neighbor. Has there been further progress on coordination of efforts on setting a timeline and getting things worked out with maybe on international agreements with the Canadians, especially when we're looking at the whole issue of spectrum? We're looking at trying to get that completed prior to or after, or what's it looking like right now at the FCC?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if you would indulge me for a moment, I'd like to respond to Mr. Kaplan. I can either do that now or...
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. And just very briefly, I think I agree with the need for transparency and engagement. I do slightly disagree with what the Commission has done over the last year. There have been 4 workshops. There have been public notices that have come out. There are 460 comments that have been filed. I have actually, of all of the panel members that are here, I think the NAB has been in more than 15 times to have meetings with the Commission staff. We welcome their engagement. We welcome the engagement of everybody on this panel. If we can do better, we'll do better with respect to that, because I think that is a crucial and important part of the incentive auction process. With respect to your question about border issues, we agree that it is an important to allow us to do as much as we can to reach agreements with Canada and Mexico, to allow us to repack, to allow us to reclaim more spectrum in the border areas. We intend, of course, to follow the statutory requirement to coordinate with Canada and Mexico. We're committed to advancing the process. We're working very closely both with the International Bureau and the Department of State. Staff-level meetings have been held for at least the last 4 or 5 months on technical matters. Chairwoman Clyburn places this at the highest priority level. She is traveling to Canada this Thursday and has asked me to accompany her to engage in further high-level discussions in order to attempt to reach agreements. What we intend to do by the time of the auction is to advance the process sufficiently to provide as much certainty as possible. It's not a different or all that unusual problem with respect to spectrum discussions and negotiations. In almost all of the auctions, like the 700 megahertz auction, the analog to digital transition, we've had similar issues and have had similar successes.
Thank you very much, and my time has expired. And the chair at this time recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, the gentleman from Michigan, the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Dingell, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for that kindness. As you know, I'm strongly interested in seeing that the incentive auctions authorized by the Middle Class Tax Relief and Job Creation Act of 2012 proceeds in a fair and transparent manner. With respect to the reverse auction, broadcasters should be treated fairly, and I will do my level best to ensure that the Commission takes no action that would derive constituents in border areas of free over-the-air television. Concerning the forward auction, the Commission should implement simple rules in a transparent manner that allow the greatest number of parties to bid on reclaimed broadcaster frequencies. As the representative of the Act's implementer, I will be most interested to hear Mr. Epstein's response. Consequently, my questions this morning will be directed at him. They will require only a yes or no. Mr. Epstein, I want to begin with a reverse auction. Section 6403B1 of the Act specifies that the Commission may, subject to international coordination along the border with Mexico and Canada, reassign and reallocate broadcast frequencies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. Epstein, in the Commission's July 2, 2013 response to my letter of inquiry about the reverse auction, you made the following statement. The language used in Section 6403B1 of the Act is, and I quote, identical to that used by the Commission in describing its handling of the earlier DTV transition, in which the Commission adopted our proposed allotments for these stations subject to our continuing negotiations with Canada, notwithstanding the broadcaster's request to the contrary. One could reasonably assume that based on that statement, that the Commission may assign and reallocate broadcast frequencies pursuant to the Act while negotiations with Canada and Mexico are still ongoing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that going to happen?
As I stated in response to the prior question, that we are doing everything we can to provide as much certainty as we can.
My people are not feeling much certainty on this matter. And I would remind you that this is subject to very intense discussions, or should be, between the United States, Mexico, and Canada in order to assure that the services to our people up there do not go dark. Is it correct that the Commission has not yet finalized its order to implement Section 6403 of the Act? Yes or no?
Yes.
In that case, Mr. Epstein, I would urge that the Commission, as final order, not to reassign or reallocate the broadcast frequencies until it has concluded negotiations with Mexico and Canada. As I noted earlier, my constituents live in a border region and stand to see television stations go dark if the Commission doesn't get this right. For their sake, I prefer you measure twice and cut once when it comes to broadcast repackaging. Now, Mr. Epstein, I'd like to turn my attention to the forward auction. I note that the Commission has had a proceeding pending on its spectrum screen since September 2012. Does the Commission intend to complete this proceeding before releasing rules for the forward auction authorized by Section 6403C of the Act? Yes or no?
Congressman, that is above my pay grade. The schedule for the Commission acting on this order is something that the Commission will take up. What I do know is that the Commission has expressed a desire to provide clarity before the incentive auction goes forward.
You were comforting me, but only slightly. Now, Mr. Epstein, Section 6403C contains an interesting subparagraph which provides that the Commission may not grant licenses through the forward auction, reassign or reallocate broadcast frequencies, or revoke spectrum usage rights unless the proceeds of the forward auction are greater than the following three factors combined. Those factors are the total amount of compensation that the Commission must pay successful bidders in the reverse auction, the costs of conducting a forward auction, and the estimated costs for the Commission to pay for broadcaster reallocations. In addition, it is in the public interest that the Commission ensure that the auction raises a significant amount of money in order to help fund the build-out of FirstNet. Together, these constitute significant pressure on the Commission to maximize the auction's revenue. Do they not?
Yes, it does.
No?
Yes.
Okay, now, Mr. Epstein, to that effect, will the Commission adopt transparent and simple rules to encourage participation by the broadest group of wireless providers in the forward auction? Yes or no?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, that the July 16 letter sent by Messrs. Engel, Butterfield, Green, Braley, Matheson, Barrow, Tonko, and I to the Commission about the forward auction, as well as any response that the Commission may tend or may care to send, to be included in the record. The entire incentive auction must be subject to rigorous and ongoing oversight in order to assure the transparency and that it achieves the Congress's intent as set forth in the Act. I thank you for your courtesy, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Epstein.
And Mr. Chairman, without objection, your letter will be, and its response, entered into our record.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. We'll now turn to a gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my questions are going to follow right along with Mr. Dingell's point, and I'll go to Mr. Epstein. You have studied the Spectrum Act to a sufficient degree that you and I can walk through, this is a question, through the auction revenue proceeds from the forward auction that are contemplated by this act. So I want to go through the sections, and you're prepared to maybe answer. 6413B3, we have $7 billion for FirstNet. 6413B2, $135 million for state and local implementation of funds. 6413B4, $100 million for public safety. Research, 6413B5, $20.4 billion for deficit reduction. We're good on the number so far?
Congressman, I don't have the statute in front of me, but it sounds correct, subject to my confirmation.
Okay, so we go to $115 million for next gen, $200 million for wireless, $1.75 billion for TV broadcasters relocation. That comes to about $28.7 billion is what's projected under the act. I'm being told. Will the auction rules that you are devising enable the production of the proceeds in this amount?
Okay, I can't predict, okay, how much money we will raise in the auction. It is a market-based auction. What our job is to make the auction attractive and simple and get maximum broadcaster participation.
Okay, let me go. If in addition to this proposed, hopefully $28.7 billion, might we also need additional proceeds to pay broadcasters who participated in the incentive auction?
The total amount of money that we will need will include the amount, of course, that we have to pay broadcasters who relinquish their spectrum.
Might it be more than 28.7?
Again, I don't have the exact numbers.
So here's the crux of the question, and it's in line with the letter that the Democrats sent. Are you designing an auction that will produce only, quote unquote, minimum proceeds described in the Spectrum Act, or are you trying to design an auction that reaches the goals of the Spectrum Act that we just kind of went over?
I think in my testimony I talked about the 4 goals that were put before us by Congress, which include to maximize the amount of spectrum which is repurposed. The second goal are the fiscal goals, which are equally important. and I talked about the statutory requirements that are to pay the broadcasters, to pay the reimbursement, to pay our.
Okay, so let me follow up, because again, there's another one I want to get to. If we impose restrictions to AT&T and Verizon, can we get these dollars?
It's an issue which is before the commission. It's an issue you heard today being debated by two of the major carriers. They take different positions on them. One carrier here says that you will maximize auctions by limiting participation. Another carrier takes the exact opposite view. So these are the difficult issues that will be before the commission to determine which of these is correct and in the public interest. And
the public interest, the public policy was designed by the legislation which was passed, which was to ensure that we had the funds available to roll out our first responder communication system and all these other applications. So we have to get it right, and that's kind of why we're focusing on this. And we know there's a struggle, but this is our best spectrum. I mean, it's not a small proceeding. This is a big deal. It's our best spectrum, and really our biggest bite at the apple, and hence the oversight hearing on this. Let me just finish up with the question, Mr. Field. You almost had me when you talked about fracking, because I was there with you until, but you do propose a position which I find is more challenging for me, that when you pull away some spectrum for other use, the remaining spectrum is going to be more valuable. I would like Ms. Ham and Ms. Marsh to respond to whether they agree with that, and why or why not.
Thank you. Well, one thing I wanted to clarify to make sure you understand, you guys were wise in putting other spectrum bands into the Spectrum Act, so it's not just the broadcast spectrum that's going to raise money for public safety. There's at least 65 megahertz, and if you want to put some of that additional DoD federal spectrum in there, you know, that can raise money.
That's a debate for another time.
Well. So there are other sources, and I just want to make sure that you understand that. So, and then, and again, your other question, excuse me.
Is when you, in essence, apportion some of the spectrum and you have a limited amount, does that make that more valuable, and the overall proceeds might be more?
Well, you know, there are a lot of different factors that go into, you know, auctions, okay? And one of the biggest factors is the amount of spectrum that's in this auction. T-Mobile's calling for a band plan that has 20 more megahertz in the auction than AT&T, okay, as part of the band plan. That's going to have a huge impact on revenue. So we want to see the maximum amount of spectrum in the auction, and we want to see the maximum amount of participation. We think that's going to raise the most revenue.
And just to correct that, so there are different variations of band plans on the record, but we all agree we need to maximize spectrum available for auction. We believe, though, we have to get the engineering right, and we cannot put forward a band plan that has engineering challenges or introduces interference. On your specific question, which I take it to be about unlicensed allocations, AT&T supports unlicensed allocations if they can exist in guard bands, including the duplex gap, and not create interference. The biggest challenge would be if we introduce unlicensed services and they interfere with adjacent licensed allocations. We will suppress the value of the licensed allocations, and we will suppress the revenue raised at auction.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just say on the unlicensed piece, I think we agree with that. We would like, you know, we want to make sure that whatever guard bands are set up for unlicensed. T-Mobile likes unlicensed. We use unlicensed. We have Wi-Fi calling in all our phones, but you know, we have to have reasonable interference.
My time is way expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Those are good answers. And you're right, we don't want this interference thing. We've had hearings on things like light squared GPS and things of that nature, and that's... We'll go now to Mr. Doyle from Pennsylvania for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Epstein, maybe just to follow up on what my friend Mr. Shimkus and Ms. Ham said, much has been made about the role the auction's going to play in funding FirstNet. And yet part of the act that created the incentive auction process also provided for multiple funding opportunities in the form of partial proceeds from other auctions going forward for the funding of FirstNet, which Ms. Ham just referred to. Just for the record, what other auctions will FirstNet draw its funding from, and how does the FCC view its obligation to raise these funds?
Let me apologize. I am innately and completely focused on the incentive auction. The
Good.
the Wireless Bureau is running a number of other auctions. You're exactly right. There are a series of auctions which will also contribute to the FirstNet and other emergency funding obligations that are there, and I can supply you with a list of those auctions which are teed up.
Thank you, Ms. Ham. Let me ask you also. You know, members of the committee and stakeholders that we've heard from today have expressed concerns that spectrum aggregation limits will result in lower auction revenue. However, when I read your testimony, T-Mobile and other carriers are arguing quite the opposite. So tell us, how can an auction with limits on bidder eligibility result in higher revenues?
Yeah, well, I think through greater participation. I think, you know, again, as I said earlier, we don't really even know how much spectrum there's going to be in this auction. And if there isn't a lot of spectrum, I think it is easier for AT&T and Verizon that have an 80% concentration in the spectrum today to be able to divide and conquer it. I think all the bidders who signed on to the letter that were put into the record, I think, would attest to the fact that having some reasonable limits, and again, we're not calling for the exclusion of AT&T and Verizon. Bear in mind, they already have 80% of the lower band spectrum. We're talking about reasonable aggregation limits to give everybody else an opportunity, a foothold on this very important spectrum.
So are you saying if there's these reasonable limits you talk about are in place, that this will encourage more participation from the smaller companies and drive up?
Absolutely.
I mean, how does it drive up
absolutely.
higher revenue?
And I draw from my experience, you know, running these spectrum auctions and the early PCS auctions. We exactly did that. We had limits on the amount. You had a situation there where you had two cellular duopolists who had 25 megahertz of spectrum, and the commission put in place limits on the ability for those duopolists to acquire PCS spectrum. The point of putting PCS spectrum out in the mid-90s, remember those huge phones you used to have and the lack of innovation and the high prices we were paying? You know, we don't want to go back there, okay? Putting this spectrum into the market is the most important auction that the commission's going to run that I can think of, okay? At least a decade. It's very important to competition. So that you need to take into consideration the competitive structure of the market, the importance of this spectrum to competition going forward.
Mr. Epstein, I want to follow up on something that my friend Ms. Eshu talked about too. I'm also very concerned that the band plans that are being offered by some stakeholders do not provide adequate spectrum for unlicensed usage. What do comments in the records at the FCC reflect on unlicensed spectrum, and how does the FCC view those comments in light of its responsibility to encourage innovation and flexible uses of spectrum?
Congressman Doyle, our original notice recognized the importance of both licensed and unlicensed spectrum. It is one of the 4 policy goals I talked about in my opening remarks. The Act permits use of unlicensed spectrum in the guard bands without auction. And what the notice does and what the Commission is committed to doing is a balanced approach. We will, of course, comply with the statutory requirement that the guard bands are not larger than technically reasonable, and the Commission will make the ultimate determination recognizing the importance of unlicensed spectrum as part of the overall plan.
Well, I would urge the FCC to issue a public notice and hold a workshop to address those issues. And finally, Mr. Epstein, and again, just for the record, because there's some concern about transparency and whether there's engagement and transparency going on at FCC, I did hear you mention that there were, 15 ex parte meetings with NAB. Just for the record, can you tell us how many times that the Commission has met with witnesses here today on the panel?
I can, but I do want to preface by saying I consider this extremely positive things that the Commission has done. We get a lot out of these meetings. We hope they will continue, and we encourage and welcome them. What our records show is that we've had 15 meetings with the NAB. We've had 11 meetings with EOBC, the patent organization, Public Knowledge 3, AT&T 8, and T-Mobile 16.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and we turn now to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing. I thank all the panelists. I know y'all are all working hard to ultimately get to the point we want to get to, and that's to have a successful spectrum auction, I do want to take a moment to commend again the chairman, which I don't do a whole lot, but I usually just make fun of him. But you know, the fact that his legislation moved forward after years and years and years of people talking about this and trying to do it, he ultimately made it happen. And so I do think it's important to note that, you know, when you see how hard it is to get things done in Congress, you know, the fact that he got us to this point is important, and that's why I think it's so important that we make sure now that it's done right. And you know, when you look at the two purposes that were brought forward when the chairman brought the legislation that was ultimately included in the final act, it was to, number one, make sure that we had the $7 billion to go and build out a national public safety network, something that hadn't been done since September 11th, and been promised by a lot of people, but ultimately finally is now at the forefront of being ready to happen. But the other part of that was to also generate additional revenue to reduce the federal deficit. And that's an important point that can't be lost when we're talking about how to set up the rules. And the rules of any game are very important, because ultimately they can have a major impact on how the game's going to be played. And so, Mr. Epstein, I want to ask you, we've had a lot of different testimony. There's been a lot of people for months and months trying to make sure that the rules are set up in a way that's fair. And in some cases, they want to make sure it's fair to them and understand that's their job. But your role is to make sure it's not only fair for the people that will be participating, but it's also fair for the American taxpayer, because the American taxpayer has a big role in this. Because if it's not set up properly, and there are limitations to entry that don't allow for the amount of bidding that ultimately yields the greatest amount of revenue, then that's less money that goes to reducing the national deficit. And that's something that we've got to watch out for, not only as legislators, but you as a regulator who's drafting these rules. If there are limitations put in place to entry that ultimately would reduce that competition, then that can reduce the revenue not only to build out an interoperable network for our first responders, but also to pay down the deficit. So when you're looking at that, are you thinking about that in addition to all the interest you're getting from the people that will hopefully be coming to bid, but also are you thinking about the fact that you need to make sure that yielding the most revenue was a big component of this act passing so that we could reduce the deficit?
Yes, Congressman, we are looking at that as a major goal. We're also looking at the overall statute, which has a series of goals, and I think, as many people have stated here, many Congress people have stated here today, it is a balancing act. But the goal that you point out, of course, is an extremely important part of that balance that must be struck.
Well, thank you, and I'd encourage you to continue to keep that in mind in view as well. I want to ask both Ms. Hamm and Ms. Marsh, because you have competing views on how that set of rules is established. And I guess, Ms. Hamm, I have trouble when you say that limitations on auction access will increase competition. I guess I'm not quite understanding that, so I want to get your take, and then also get Ms. Marsh's comment on that as well.
Sure, thank you for that question. I think the broad participation in the auctions that I've had experience with, where you have broad participation, so you have a lot of bidders bidding on a lot of markets, those are the healthy auctions that are going to raise revenue, okay? Plain and simple. I think T-Mobile, together with large regional carriers that submitted the letter today, all are calling for limits, okay? Because they believe that it will make it more likely that they'll participate than if you don't have those limits. So reasonable limits, and again, I think T-Mobile is not suggesting excluding AT&T and Verizon, okay? Understanding they have 80% of the low-band spectrum today, okay? We're not saying exclude them. We're saying give other people a shot at this very important spectrum, okay?
Thanks. If I could get
and
Ms.
we
Marsh's...
think getting strong competition in the auction is the way to raise the revenues.
Thanks. Ms. Marsh.
Yes. And I think to understand what's going to happen at this auction, we don't need to go back to the PCS auction. We should look at what happened in the last major auction, the 700 megahertz auction. There were 214 qualified bidders, and of those, and it was an open participation auction, no one was limited or excluded in any way. 101 bidders won licenses at that auction, and even though it was a difficult economic climate at the time, revenues exceeded congressional expectations by over $10 billion. an open auction can succeed and produce a diversity of winners. Now, Mr. Feld suggested a lot of companies were shut out. Let me point to a couple companies who signed the letter that Ms. Ham just referred to that won significant spectrum at that auction. Dish won 168 licenses, including spectrum covering most of the United States. King Street Wireless, who has partnered with U.S. Cellular to deploy LTE services in 700 megahertz, was the 4th largest winner in that auction on a megahertz POPs basis. C-Spire, who is also deploying LTE services in its territory, was the 10th largest winner. An open auction with full participation can result in a diversity of bidders, and it will maximize revenues consistent with congressional intent. And if I have a moment, I'd also like to respond to some of the comments made about low-band spectrum. There's been a lot of discussion about the importance of this auction because it is low-band spectrum. In a broadband world, it is about capacity, and capacity is driven by two things. The width of the band you can put together, regardless of where it sits. It's about how wide the channels are and how dense you build the network. In that type of environment, it's not about low band or high band spectrum. It's about putting together wide band spectrum and building very dense networks. And any advantage that may have been perceived from the low band spectrum in a voice world is very much negated in a broadband world where it's really about capacity and not coverage.
Well, thanks. I appreciate your testimony. Look forward to a successful spectrum auction. Do want to mention that the broadcasters ought to be treated fairly because they are an active participant in this, sometimes maybe inactive, but they ought to be treated fairly in the impact it will have on them. And I know FCC is looking at that as well. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Telecommunications Industry Association, the leading trade association for global manufacturers, vendors, and suppliers of information communications technology, supporting broad auction participation and maximizing licensed spectrum. Without objection, that'll be entered into the record. I think that concludes our hearing for today. We really appreciate your testimony, your counsel, the work that you're doing. Obviously, there are some issues that still need to be resolved. We took note of that. But we commend you as you move forward to work this out. So we have a successful auction, so we continue to be the generator of innovation and new technologies and generate some revenue to pay for first responders and lower our deficit.
Thank you. Chairman, may I ask you
Yes.
to just, I would like to thank you for the excellence of this hearing and bringing together the witnesses that we have here today. Very important. You've all been instructive, and bravo, Mr. Chairman.
Well,
this is really enlightening for the subcommittee, and I'm very pleased that there are 2 women, even though they don't agree with each other. 2 women in very high positions in very important American companies. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
And it's a team effort, as you know, organizing our panels, so we appreciate you and your staff's work as well. And with that, we will stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.